Imagine standing on a crowded American city street in the late 1890s. The air is thick with the sound of chatter, the clatter of horse-drawn wagons, the bell of a trolley, and the laughter of children playing stickball right in the center of the road. There are no marked crosswalks. There are no traffic signals. There are no curbs defining where a person is allowed to stand and where they are forbidden to step. For centuries, the street was not a chute for private vehicles. It was a public plaza, a shared commons belonging equally to pedestrians, vendors, neighbors, and children. Then, out of nowhere, a mechanical terror invaded this shared world. A terrifying, smoke-spewing iron carriage, traveling at a staggering 15 miles per hour, tore through the crowd, scattering horses and crushing anyone who could not scramble out of the way in time. In the 1890s, these early automobiles were viewed not as the future of transportation, but as dangerous, noisy, arrogant toys for the ultra-wealthy elite. Rich young men tore through public spaces, leaving a trail of terror and broken bones behind them. And yet, there was no law to stop them. No driver ever taken a test, no vehicle carried a license plate, and across the entire United States there was not a single speed limit on the books. Anyone with enough money to buy an engine could drive as fast as they wanted, wherever they wanted, with absolute legal impunity. And it was catastrophic. Today we take it for granted that streets belong exclusively to cars. We accept that human beings must cross at designated white lines, wait for electronic permission signals, and yield the right of way to multi-ton steel machines. If you step off the sidewalk at the wrong spot, you are committing a crime. You are a jaywalker. We are taught from childhood that speed limits and traffic codes were created by benevolent public officials to keep pedestrians safe from harm. But that story is a complete fabrication. Speed limits and traffic regulations were not designed to protect human life. They were engineered by automobile manufacturers who realized that if cities banned their dangerous vehicles to save dying children, their multi-billion-dollar industry would be destroyed in its infancy. So Packard, Studebaker, and General Motors launched one of the most aggressive propaganda campaigns in human history. They redefined public roads as private corporate zones, invented a fake crime to blame the victims of vehicular slaughter, and stripped citizens of their right to the street. So how did a handful of corporate executives convince an entire nation to surrender its public spaces and criminalize walking? To understand how automobile corporations stole the streets of America, we have to go back to 1901, to the moment the very first speed limit was born. In May of 1901, the state of Connecticut took a desperate step into the unknown. Recognizing that the explosive arrival of motor carriages was rapidly transforming serene downtown corridors into war zones, state legislators enacted the very first statewide speed limit in American history. The law was strict for its day, capping speeds at a maximum of 12 miles per hour inside city limits and 15 miles per hour along rural dirt roads. It was a modest attempt to restore order to a nation that had never before needed a law to tell a traveler how fast they were allowed to move. But Connecticut's pioneer legislation was merely a finger in a bursting dike. Within a decade, Henry Ford's assembly lines were churning out thousands of heavy, fast metal machines every single month, flooding narrow city grids that had been designed for horses, pushcarts, and foot traffic. What followed was a decade of unprecedented urban slaughter. Throughout the 1920s, as automobile ownership exploded across the country, over 200,000 Americans were killed in motor vehicle accidents on public roads. Let that statistic sink in for a moment. 200,000 lives wiped out in a single decade, a civilian body count that rivaled the bloodiest military campaigns in American history. Even more horrifying was the identity of the victims. In cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit, over 70% of those crushed under the wheels of early automobiles were children. They were youngsters playing hopscotch on the asphalt, running after rolling balls, or helping their mothers carry groceries across the street. The public reaction was swift, visceral, and furious. Newspaper editorials routinely referred to drivers as reckless murderers, corporate joyriders, and speed demons. Editorial cartoons portrayed the automobile as a mechanical grim reaper, scything down innocent toddlers in cold blood. In Baltimore, grieving citizens erected a stark marble monument dedicated solely to the memory of local children killed by automobiles. In Detroit, judges publicly condemned drivers who struck pedestrians, declaring from the bench that a person walking in the street had a sacred, indisputable right to be there without fearing for their life. And legally, those judges were entirely correct. This was the fundamental structural flaw that threatened the entire foundation of the automotive industry. Under centuries of established common law, the street was recognized as an open public commons. The law dictated that pedestrians held an absolute, equal right to use every square inch of the roadway at any time for any reason. If a driver operated a heavy, dangerous mechanical apparatus on a shared public road and struck a person walking, the driver was almost universally held legally liable for the injury or death. The legal burden to avoid a collision rested entirely on the person controlling the machine, not on the citizen stepping off the sidewalk. By 1923, the public outrage had reached a boiling point that posed an existential threat to the car industry. In Cincinnati, Ohio, after dozens of children were crushed in the streets in a matter of months, local citizens organized a massive political revolt. They gathered over 42,000 signatures to put a radical safety law on the municipal ballot, an ordinance that would legally force every car owner to install a mechanical governor on their engine, physically preventing any vehicle from traveling faster than 20 miles per hour anywhere in the city. The executive suites in Detroit and Flint panicked. They realized with absolute clarity that if Cincinnati passed that law, every major city in America would follow suit. If cars were legally capped at 20 miles per hour and drivers were permanently held criminally liable for every pedestrian injury, the automobile would remain an impractical, expensive toy. The multi-billion-dollar automotive empire was on the verge of being outlawed before it could even fully take root. Hold that Cincinnati ballot initiative in your mind. And remember the year 1924, because a coordinated counterattack was already being engineered behind closed doors. Local municipal governments were paralyzed by the rising death toll, entirely incapable of balancing public safety with industrial expansion. The traditional legal system stubbornly defended the pedestrians' right to the road. The government was powerless to resolve the slaughter. And into that chaotic vacuum stepped an elite alliance of corporate titans, public relations operatives, and unelected bureaucrats, men whom the public had never voted for, but who were about to rewrite the rules of American public space forever. To understand how the street was stolen, you first have to understand the man who inadvertently built the machinery used to steal it. His name was William Phelps Eno, a man born in 1858 into staggering aristocratic wealth, whose father had accumulated a fortune in real estate and trade. Eno was not a politician, not a civil engineer, and not an elected official. He was a wealthy, eccentric patrician who possessed a deep, almost obsessive hatred of urban disorder. Long before cars flooded Manhattan, Eno spent hours standing on city corners, watching horse-drawn cabs, delivery wagons, and pedestrians collide in chaotic intersections. He became convinced that the chaos of the American city could be solved through rigid, mathematical organization. In 1903, Eno published a landmark treatise titled Rules of the Road, proposing unprecedented concepts that we now consider permanent features of human civilization. He designed the modern stop sign, the pedestrian safety island, the traffic circle, and the concept of the one-way street. He personally drafted the very first official traffic code for New York City, creating a standardized set of rules for how vehicles should move through shared space. By all accounts, Eno considered himself a grand civic benefactor, a man bringing enlightenment and order to the chaotic commons. But here is the detail that quietly breaks the myth in half. William Phelps Eno, the undisputed father of traffic safety, never learned how to drive a car. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who laid the intellectual blueprint for modern vehicular control spent his entire life being chauffeured in a horse-drawn carriage or a private automobile, refusing to ever operate a motor engine himself. To Eno, streets were balanced public ecosystems where horses, carts, and human beings shared space under strict rules of mutual courtesy. He believed that vehicles must always yield to the safety of the pedestrian. He was hopelessly naive, because while Eno was designing safety codes to protect human life, an elite cabal of industrial titans was watching his work with calculating interest. Men like Alvan Macaulay, the formidable president of the Packard Motor Car Company, Walter White of Studebaker, and senior executives across General Motors and Ford realized that Eno's concept of traffic regulation could be hijacked, twisted, and weaponized. They did not want streets to be a balanced ecosystem shared by human beings and carriages. They wanted total dominance. The auto magnates recognized a terrifying financial reality. If cities followed traditional common law and treated streets as public parks where pedestrians had the right to walk anywhere, the automobile would be permanently restricted to a crawling snail's pace. If a car could not travel faster than a horse without facing lawsuits and public fury, nobody would buy one. The entire multi-billion-dollar future of the automotive industry depended on a radical, unprecedented inversion of human culture. The public had to be driven off the road, and the road had to be surrendered to the machine. To pull off this massive cultural theft, the industry needed to launch a psychological war on the American public. They started by attacking the very language people used to describe the street. In the early 1920s, the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, representing the nation's premier auto manufacturers, created a specialized public relations bureau dedicated to re-engineering public consciousness. They realized that whenever a driver killed a child, the newspapers blamed the driver and the automobile. The industry needed to shift the blame from the killer to the victim, so they invented a villain, and they called that villain the Jaywalker. To understand the psychological brutality of this public relations campaign, you have to understand what the word jay meant in the early 20th century. In the slang of the 1920s, a jay was a derisive, humiliating term for an ignorant country bumpkin, an unsophisticated hick who came to the big city and did not know how to behave. It was an insult designed to provoke intense social shame. The auto lobby deliberately took this obscure insult and weaponized it against city residents. They funded national publicity campaigns, wrote pre-packaged articles, and distributed them free of charge to hundreds of local newspapers across America. When an auto safety story appeared in a local paper, it was rarely written by an independent journalist. It was drafted word for word by corporate agents working for Packard, Ford, and General Motors. These planted articles relentlessly mocked anyone who dared to cross the street outside a designated intersection, painting them as ignorant rubes who were too stupid to navigate modern urban life. The industry paid local boycott groups, sponsored safety parades where actors dressed as clowns were labeled jaywalkers, and even hired Boy Scouts to hand out cards on street corners publicly shaming adults who stepped off the sidewalk. Historian Peter Norton, in his seminal work Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, documents how auto manufacturers systematically rewrote the social norms of the street. Norton's research demonstrates that before 1920, the idea that a person could be arrested or shamed for simply walking across a public street was completely absurd to the average American. The industry did not just change the law, they brainwashed the public into believing that victims of traffic violence were responsible for their own deaths. Think about what this meant. If a 7-year-old child stepped into the street to retrieve a bouncing ball and was struck by a 2-ton vehicle traveling at 30 miles per hour, the PR apparatus went to work instantly. The headline in the paper the next morning would not read "Car Kills Child." It would read "Jaywalking Child Struck by Automobile." By shifting the blame to the victim, the auto industry began to neutralize the legal liability of drivers. But social shaming was only the first phase. Propaganda could change public opinion, but to permanently secure the streets for private corporate vehicles, the industry needed the backing of the state. They needed to turn corporate PR into federal policy. And for that, they found their ultimate architect in Washington, D.C. His name was Herbert Hoover. In 1924, Herbert Hoover was serving as the United States Secretary of Commerce. Long before he became president and presided over the Great Depression, Hoover was celebrated as the ultimate technocrat, a brilliant engineer who believed that society's problems could be solved through central planning and corporate cooperation. Recognizing the national crisis of skyrocketing traffic fatalities and sensing an opportunity to shape the future of American commerce, Hoover convened the National Conference on Street and Highway Safety in 1924. On its surface, the conference was presented to the public as a high-minded neutral government effort to bring order to the dangerous chaos of American roads. But behind the heavy oak doors of the Department of Commerce, the composition of the conference revealed its true nature. Hoover did not assemble a panel of urban planners, pedestrian safety advocates, neighborhood leaders, or child welfare experts. Instead, the conference was dominated, funded, and directed by representatives from the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, the American Automobile Association, insurance company executives, and auto manufacturing lobbyists. The very corporations that were causing the slaughter were given official government authority to write the regulations governing their own industry. Out of this landmark 1924 conference came the first model municipal traffic code, a standardized set of rules explicitly designed to be adopted by cities across the United States. Historian Peter Norton's analysis of the 1924 proceedings reveals the devastating genius of this document. The Model Traffic Code did not restrict the speed or weight of automobiles to protect pedestrians. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It legally restricted the movement of human beings. For the first time in American history, a government-backed document declared that streets were primarily intended for the movement of vehicular traffic. Walking across a street between intersections was explicitly redefined as a crime. The traditional common law right of the pedestrian to use the entirety of the road was officially erased, replaced by a legal framework that turned the public commons into a corporate highway. Stop and look at the shape of this thing. A private industry, facing an existential public backlash over thousands of dead children, successfully used a federal cabinet secretary to draft a legal code that criminalized the victims and handed exclusive ownership of public streets to private automobile owners. They had the plan. They had the power. Now they needed to make it real across every city in America without the public ever realizing that their freedom had been stolen. From an institutional and corporate perspective, economic historians note that industrial expansion during the 20th century operated within a regulatory vacuum where corporate incentives directly aligned with systemic risk-taking. Scholars documenting industrial history point out that executive decision-making was fundamentally structured by fiduciary duties to maximize short-term shareholder value, leading management to minimize, defer, or suppress emerging scientific warnings. What appeared as a deliberate conspiracy was often the predictable output of corporate incentives operating without public oversight. With the endorsement of the Department of Commerce locked behind them, the architects of the automotive industry launched what was arguably the most sophisticated social engineering campaign of the 20th century. Herbert Hoover had provided the official government cover, framing corporate dominance as scientific public safety, but turning that vision into reality required a relentless nationwide psychological assault. The public still viewed the street as a sacred commons, and judges across the country were still sending drivers to prison for striking pedestrians. To break that deep-seated cultural instinct, the auto lobby could not simply change the laws. They had to reprogram the American mind. They needed to make the public believe that a human being walking in the street was not an innocent citizen exercising a historic right, but an uncivilized hazard disrupting the natural order of modern progress. The orchestrators of this campaign operated through front organizations and industry associations like the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, establishing dedicated publicity bureaus staffed by early pioneers of modern public relations. Every week, these corporate bureaus churned out thousands of pre-packaged news articles, editorial opinions, and safety bulletins, distributing them free of charge to rural and urban newspapers across the country. Cash-strapped editors, desperate for free content, printed these stories word for word without disclosing their corporate origins. To the average reader sipping morning coffee in Ohio or Kansas, it appeared as though their local newspaper was independently reporting on a rising tide of pedestrian carelessness. The coverage systematically avoided discussing vehicle speed, heavy iron chassis, or mechanical failures, focusing instead on the reckless behavior of citizens who dared to walk where they had always walked. And then came the deliberate, aggressive deployment of social shame. The industry took the term jaywalker, a derogatory slur previously reserved for uneducated rural visitors who gawked at city buildings, and saturated the public consciousness with it. In major metropolitan areas, auto associations funded elaborate street spectacles designed to mock pedestrians. They hired actors to dress as clowns or absurd country bumpkins, sending them into city traffic where they were publicly ridiculed by megaphones and chased back onto the sidewalk by paid performers. In cities like Detroit and Cleveland, local auto clubs coordinated with school boards to recruit Boy Scouts, placing uniformed children on busy intersections to hand out physical warning cards to adults who crossed outside painted lines. Think about what this means. Children were being utilized as corporate proxies to publicly humiliate their own parents and neighbors for stepping into spaces that their families had owned for generations. The genius of this psychological offensive lay in its ability to weaponize public education under the guise of civic duty. Auto manufacturers began supplying schools with safety curriculums, coloring books, and essay contests, embedding a single message into the minds of millions of American children. The street belongs to cars, and the sidewalk belongs to people. A child who stepped off the curb without looking was taught that they were disobeying authority rather than occupying a shared public park. The industry was not merely managing current public opinion. They were raising a new generation of Americans who would grow up believing that cars held a natural, God-given sovereignty over the earth. And this brings us directly back to the explosive political crisis in Cincinnati that had sent shockwaves through the corporate boardrooms of Detroit in late 1923. Remember those 42,000 signatures gathered by terrified citizens seeking to mandate mechanical speed governors capped at 20 miles per hour on every local vehicle? That ballot initiative was the single greatest threat the industry had ever faced, because if it passed, it would set a legal precedent that could spread across the nation and permanently cap the speed, power, and profitability of the motor car. In response, auto executives formed a massive secretive emergency coalition, flooding Cincinnati with money, corporate operatives, and relentless propaganda. They ran full-page newspaper advertisements claiming that speed governors would cripple local businesses, delay emergency vehicles, and plunge the city into economic ruin. On Election Day in November of 1923, the auto industry's overwhelming financial dominance prevailed, and the Cincinnati Speed Governor Ordinance was decisively defeated at the ballot box. But the magnates knew that defeating a single local initiative was not enough. They needed a permanent, national shield that would eradicate similar grassroots rebellions forever. That shield was the first model municipal traffic code produced under Herbert Hoover's conference in 1924 and fully finalized for city adoption by 1928. Now here is where the story takes its sharpest turn and where the true scale of the deception becomes fully visible. The model municipal traffic code was presented to state legislatures and city halls as a harmless, standardized framework designed by objective government experts to streamline traffic flow and reduce injuries. But behind that scientific veneer lay a devastating legal inversion. Historian Peter Norton, in his groundbreaking research Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, demonstrates how this model code systematically stripped away centuries of legal protections that had safeguarded pedestrians under traditional common law. For centuries, common law held that anyone on a dangerous heavy machine in a shared public space bore strict legal liability if that machine caused harm to a human being. The driver was required to yield to the pedestrian, regardless of where the pedestrian was standing or walking. The model municipal traffic code completely inverted this principle. It established that streets were primarily intended for the rapid movement of motor vehicles, while human beings were restricted to narrow sidewalks and designated crosswalks. If a citizen stepped outside those painted boundaries and was struck by a car, the legal burden shifted away from the driver and onto the pedestrian. Walking in the street was no longer an exercise of a historic civil right. It was legally classified as a misdemeanor. Sit with that irony for a moment. An industry that was slaughtering tens of thousands of citizens every single year successfully persuaded state and local governments to rewrite the law so that the victims of that violence were branded as criminals. The physical environment of American cities was rapidly transformed to enforce this new legal reality. Municipal authorities began installing concrete curbs, metal guardrails, and bright white crosswalk lines, physically partitioning the public realm into zones of corporate movement and zones of human containment. The open public plaza that had defined human settlement for thousands of years was systematically dismantled and replaced by a segmented corridor engineered exclusively for the internal combustion engine. Cities that refused to adopt the model code voluntarily were subjected to intense lobbying pressure from local automobile clubs, real estate developers, and merchant groups who had been convinced that vehicular access was the sole driver of economic prosperity. To understand how completely this corporate strategy succeeded, one only needs to examine internal documents and transcripts from auto industry executives during the late 1920s. In private meetings, leaders from Packard, Studebaker, and General Motors openly celebrated the transition, noting that public hostility toward the automobile had plummeted as the narrative shifted from dangerous speeders to negligent pedestrians. They had successfully framed the deadly consequences of their product not as a structural flaw of mass automobility, but as an individual failure of personal responsibility. By 1930, the stealth implementation was complete. In less than a single decade, an elite coalition of industrial magnates, public relations operatives, and federal bureaucrats had executed a total transformation of American law, language, and urban space. They took the shared commons that had belonged to every citizen since the founding of the Republic, stripped the public of their rights, and handed exclusive ownership of the streets to private automotive corporations. The public never voted on this transformation in a national election. No constitutional amendment was ever proposed to alter the fundamental right to public space. The system was in place. The public never saw it happen, and it would never be removed. This investigation connects directly to the broader architecture of control we unravel across secret state files, where isolated historical decisions aggregate into the modern system governing our daily lives. What began as a clever public relations trick to save motor companies from bankruptcy in the 1920s metastasized into the complete physical restructuring of the entire American continent. The takeover of the street was only the first domino. Once the legal system declared that public roads existed exclusively for motor vehicles, the very geometry of human settlement was forced to bend to the machine. Cities were no longer built for people, they were built for cars. Over the subsequent decades, federal highway acts carved massive concrete trenches through vibrant urban neighborhoods, destroying historic working-class communities, displacing millions of residents and severing the organic social fabric of American towns. Suburban sprawl was born not from a natural consumer preference, but from an aggressive engineered policy that rendered walking impossible. Zoning laws mandated vast asphalt parking lots for every commercial building, while public transit systems across the country were systematically bought up, dismantled, and replaced by private vehicles. Look at where that corporate victory has led us today. In the United States alone, over 40,000 human beings are killed on public roads every single year. Read that number again. 40,000 lives erased annually, accompanied by millions of life-altering injuries, medical bankruptcies, and destroyed families. American pedestrian mortality rates have surged to terrifying 40-year highs, driven by the proliferation of massive multi-ton trucks and utility vehicles whose elevated hood lines are engineered for private driver comfort rather than public safety. A citizen living in a modern American suburb who cannot afford a private vehicle or who is physically unable to drive is effectively placed under house arrest, cut off from employment, fresh food, and community. We live in a society where public space has been almost entirely privatized, where a human being standing on an unpaved roadside is viewed with suspicion by law enforcement, and where the simple act of walking across a street remains a high-stakes gamble with death. I want to be very precise here because the scale of this physical and social capture is so vast that it can feel almost unbelievable. It is documented that the automotive lobby, operating through powerful trade associations, spent hundreds of millions of dollars over decades lobbying Congress to ensure that the vast majority of federal transportation funds were locked exclusively into highway expansion rather than public transit. It is documented that corporate entities connected to the automotive sector deliberately purchased municipal electric streetcar systems in major American cities throughout the mid-20th century and systematically dismantled them to eliminate competition for motor vehicles. What remains debated among historians is whether the early corporate architects of the 1920s fully anticipated the catastrophic public health, environmental, and social isolation crises that their vision would inflict on 21st century society, or if they were simply ruthlessly focused on immediate corporate expansion. But the physical result is not in dispute. Step back and look at the pattern, because the story of how America lost its streets is not an isolated historical accident. The playbook is always the same: crisis, architect, secret implementation, permanent control. First, a new technology creates a devastating societal crisis that threatens to provoke public regulation. Next, unelected corporate architects step into the political vacuum, presenting themselves as neutral experts while secretly writing the rules of the system behind closed doors. Then, through aggressive propaganda and deceptive legal frameworks, the burden of safety and responsibility is inverted, shifting liability off the corporate producer and onto the vulnerable citizen. And finally, the temporary corporate intervention becomes a permanent, inescapable architecture of daily life that future generations accept as entirely natural. The modern citizen does not question why a 9-year-old child cannot safely walk 3 blocks to a local park without crossing 4 lanes of high-speed traffic. We do not question why billions of tax dollars are poured into expanding 12-lane highways while municipal bus routes are gutted and passenger rail lines wither. We accept the noise, the pollution, the isolation, and the staggering body count as the unavoidable cost of modern progress. But it was never unavoidable. It was manufactured. The open public commons where human beings gathered for centuries was stolen, rebranded, and sold back to us as freedom. Take a look out your window right now, or step onto the street outside your front door. Look at the thick concrete curbs, the bright white painted crosswalks, the heavy metal guardrails, and the glowing traffic signals quietly dictating whether you are legally permitted to step into the open air. We grow up believing these painted lines and electronic permission lights are neutral, timeless safety features of human civilization. We assume they were created by benevolent public servants to protect human life. But now you know the truth. Every white strip of paint on the asphalt is a territorial boundary line drawn by corporate lawyers and public relations operatives in the 1920s. Every curbing was engineered not to shield your body, but to strip away your historic common law right to the street, penning you onto a narrow sidewalk so that multi-ton metal machines could speed unhindered through what used to be a shared public plaza. Remember the world of the 1890s, where children played stickball in the road and neighbors gathered without fear. That world did not die naturally. It was actively cleared away. It is worth being precise here about what the documented historical record actually establishes. Serious historians like Peter Norton do not suggest that auto executives at Packard, Ford, and General Motors were cartoonish villains plotting in dark rooms to destroy human health or deliberately force future generations into suburban isolation. They were hard-headed industrial pragmatists operating in cold self-interest. They faced an existential public relations crisis, a slaughter of over 200,000 citizens in a single decade that threatened to bankrupt their burgeoning multi-billion-dollar industry before it could mature. What is documented fact is that they funded massive propaganda bureaus, invented a humiliating social insult to shame dead pedestrians, shifted legal liability away from drivers, and leveraged federal authority under Herbert Hoover to draft the traffic codes that turned public roads into corporate corridors. Whether the resulting suburban sprawl, environmental degradation, and physical decay of walkable human communities were intentional long-term goals or simply reckless collateral damage remains a subject of ongoing debate. But the physical and social trap we live inside today is not in dispute. So the next time you stand patiently at a quiet intersection on a cold afternoon, waiting for an electronic box to flash a white silhouette, giving you permission to cross a road paid for by your own tax dollars, stop and look at the geometry around you. Ask yourself a simple, unsettling question. Was this world built to serve human beings, or were human beings systematically reprogrammed to serve private machines? And now that you know who wrote the rules of the road and stole the shared commons, do you still feel comfortable living inside the lines they painted for you? If you want to look past the sanitized official history and uncover the hidden blueprints of the invisible systems that govern our everyday lives, subscribe to Secret State Files right now. Join a growing community of critical thinkers who refuse to take the modern world at face value. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe American cities can ever win back the streets from automotive dominance, or has corporate engineering permanently locked us into car dependency? Next time, we step inside a private, moonless rail car where a secret gathering of bankers quietly rewrote the financial rules of the entire Western world.